thank you for stopping by Cross My Heart Ministry and welcome you to this Monday video that we call Martha Monday. Today I want to talk to you about reading aloud to your children. Certainly that's always a good idea. If you have children around, why not read to them? Turn off the TV, step away from technology, stop the screen time, and get back to enjoying just a precious book together. Now, if you have preschoolers in your family or little toddlers, they love to read. In fact, they're probably dragging board books to you and little picture books, and you've read them over and over and over to the point that you have them memorized. I know that was my reality when my children were little. I remember getting so excited when my oldest became old enough to read a chapter book. And so the very first chapter book that I read aloud to my little guy, I think, was most likely Charlotte's Web. You know, we talk about reading aloud to our children, and in fact, I had a previous video where I challenged you to give yourself the gift of some reading time. I called that Dear Time, drop everything and read. But we can also do that if you have children or grandchildren home, especially during this time of isolation. If we're living in the middle of this pandemic and we all have to be home anyway, why not make some time to turn off the television and enjoy some good books? I've grabbed a few of our favorites from when I was reading aloud to my children and raising them, and I thought that I would just take this time to encourage you to consider trying some of these or some others. As I read aloud to my children, certainly they were already reading themselves. So reading aloud is not only for preschoolers and little ones. In fact, we started reading aloud. We just started a policy of reading aloud and having a read aloud book going even into their high school years. I would read aloud when they were in elementary, middle school, and high school, because those shared memories, sharing a good book, bonded us together and gave us a reason to laugh and just enjoy the pleasure of a well-crafted story together. Through reading a good book, we traveled geographically to other parts of the world. We traveled through time to different eras. We read a lot of historical fiction and gained an understanding of historical things that happened. And so I just want to share some ideas today with you on exactly how to read aloud. Instead of just picking it up and starting to read, maybe some of these ideas will give you some ideas for enjoying that read aloud time with your children or grandchildren. Well, the first thing is to snuggle up. So get yourself a good little comforter or a little throw and find a good comfy couch and snuggle up together with one on your lap and one on either side. There's nothing like snuggling up to read aloud together. Now, your teenagers may balk at that, but while they're little, you can cultivate that habit of snuggling up. When you pick up the book, instead of just jumping in, I always would like to read the title and the author when I began. So it's sort of a way of giving credit where credit is due and helping them remember the name of that book. So I would pick this up and say, this is Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. And when you look at that cover, it also gives us a little bit more information. It tells us author of Stuart Little. So I might say to the children, well, maybe if we like this book, we'll consider reading that other book that he wrote. It also, in this one, has some illustrations. So it says pictures by Garth Williams. So we can give Mr. Williams credit as well. And you might talk to your children about a word called illustrations, because sometimes it won't say pictures, it'll say illustrated by. And so we give that credit for credit is due when we begin. So before we jump and start in with the story, I like to also go and look at the copyright date. So this is tip number 3, to note the copyright date. And so when I would read this to the children, I would try to take that year and put it in some sort of perspective for our family. So I might say, this says copyright 1952. The copyright year is the year that the author wrote this book, and this book was written in 1952. And I might say to the children, your granny was born in 1952. If I'm reading it to my grandchildren, I would say, that's your great-grandmother, that's Grammy's mother. And so maybe Granny was a little girl in West Virginia reading this book when she was 10 years old, not much older than you are now, and she enjoyed this very same book. Next time we talk to her on the phone, let's ask Granny if she read Charlotte's Web by E.B. White when she was a little girl. The next thing is to savor the opening. You know, we can sometimes just jump right in and start reading it. And when you begin the book, Charlotte's Web, Chapter 1 says before breakfast, and the opening says this: "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Well, Where is Papa going with that axe? And what an interesting opening. And you can talk to them and wonder and think aloud about what might Papa be doing with an axe. And that little girl is in the kitchen getting ready for breakfast with her mother, and maybe Papa having an axe was unusual. If Papa always chopped firewood every day, maybe she wouldn't be surprised that he has an axe. But when she saw her father with an axe, it surprised her. And doesn't it make us curious? Wonder what Papa is going to do with that axe. I learned several years ago at a little writing workshop I attended at a homeschool convention, I think by Julie. I don't remember her last name, but I think the book she wrote was Brave Writer. And she was talking about the power of an opening. And I've always remembered that. And as I taught my children to write, I always wanted to encourage them to have a good hook, to have a good opening, to sort of get the reader in and draw their interest. And so you learn to be a good writer, or to write a good speech or write a good story by having a good opening. And part of the way you learn to do that is by observing how good authors open up their books. Rarely do you see a good book that begins once upon a time. There's usually some sort of interesting hook that draws us in and makes us wonder and makes us think. So notice that opening with your children, savor that opening, and think about that and talk about that and get them wondering and thinking about where the story is headed after that. And then don't just chase the storyline. As excited as we all are to find out what happens next, take some time to enjoy the giftedness of the writer. Look at those well-crafted sentences. Notice good use of vocabulary. Notice those big 50-cent words and ask them if they know what they mean and try to incorporate those into language later. I learned from my daughter Ginger, she was maybe 5 years old, and she was so intentional about her vocabulary. She would stop me, and in her little lispy voice, maybe even younger than 5, now that I remember, she would say, wait, Mommy, what was that word? What was that word? And I would stop and repeat it, and she would say, what does that mean? And we would talk about the vocabulary word and what it means. I would read the sentence again, and I would see her saying it to herself. Her eyes would sort of roll back. It was almost like I could literally see her filing it away in her little brain. And sure enough, in the next couple of days, I would see that word come out of her mouth, and she would intentionally grow her own vocabulary, even as a little girl, by using that word. Well, you may not have a child that just loves words like she did. Ginger actually grew up to be an English major and quite a gifted writer. But you can encourage them to develop their vocabulary by noting words that you see in the book that you're reading aloud, you using it yourself, and then overusing it to the point that it becomes funny, and encourage them to use that word as well. So pay attention to word usage, pay attention to the way the author structures the sentence. Not every sentence begins subject, verb, how they use phrases, how they use interesting words, how they just describe words. Pay attention to literary devices. You might need to bone up yourself on what is a metaphor and what is a simile, and where they use the word like or as. And if the author uses personification. Personification, if you don't remember from your high school English class, is when the author uses something that's not living and treats it as if it is, gives it a person type attribute. So you might say, the engine growled, for example, something like that. And then you might notice some foreshadowing. And foreshadowing is when you sort of get a little hint of something else that might be coming, and the author sort of drops those little breadcrumbs that get you thinking ahead to something that might happen later. So notice those literary devices as you read aloud. It might be interesting to keep a quote journal. If there's a special quote in the book that is just very special and you might want to use it later, or you're teaching your children to write, go ahead and keep a family quote journal. Or if they're old enough, encourage them to have their own journal and to write down some of those quotes. And then finally, read with a passion and use the voices. Don't just read with a ho-hum type of voice, but as you read aloud to your children, be sure that you're reading with passion and excitement, and let your voice and your facial expressions demonstrate that you're enjoying that book as much as they are. Show some excitement. Even if you weren't a thespian in high school, you can get excited to read aloud to your children. If you are an empty nester, maybe reading aloud together as a couple would be something that you could enjoy doing together with your husband. You could get a good book, and it might not be one of these, but you can take turns reading a chapter aloud instead of just watching something on television. Share a good book. If you have adult children, consider letting all of them make a nomination and then vote and choose a book that you may give all of them that same book for Christmas, and then during the course of the year, maybe you all read that together and you make some time on a Zoom call or a merged call or FaceTime or whatever to discuss that book and what you're learning from it and what some of your takeaways are. So I'm going to add a link below where you can see a list of some of our favorite family read-alouds from when our children were being raised and some of the books that we read aloud to them. I've stacked up a few of those here for you to see. But some of our favorites, the Little House series by Laura Ingalls Wilder, where we traveled across the West in a covered wagon with Laura and then looked at some of her adventures. We learned about ancient Egypt when we read Eloise Jarvis McGraw's The Golden Goblet, and that just had us holding our breath to see what would happen next. We learned about Puritan America thanks to Elizabeth George Spear when we read The Witch of Blackbird Pond. And then we had our imaginations ignited by C.S. Lewis when we read the Chronicles of Narnia series. Those are just a few. I'm going to list all those on a link below, like I said. But thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I hope that you're challenged to read aloud to your children, but also have given you just a couple of tips on how you can make that read aloud time fun and educational and just grow their memories, grow their imaginations. And the thing about reading aloud to a child is that it encourages them to be a lifelong reader. And so wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to know that your children are going to enjoy reading for pleasure during their entire lives? I prayed when my children were little that they would have an intellectual curiosity, that they would love to read, and God has been very faithful to answer that prayer. Thanks so much for watching today. I'm Laura McFarland. Thanks for joining me on this Monday edition as I challenge you to read aloud to your children. If you're a regular subscriber, thank you so much. If you're not, it's easy, doesn't cost a thing. Click that big red subscribe button. If you like the content of today's video, please click the like button. And before you leave, would you please leave in the comments below the name of a book that you enjoyed reading as a child or a book that you enjoyed reading aloud to your own children. Thanks so much. Happy reading. Make some time this week to drop everything and read.